Today's film is absolutely crazy in absolutely all the right ways. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. Folks, it's my absolute honor to have with us today director Alex Cox to discuss his 1987 film, Walker. The good news is today's episode was made possible by the fine folks at the Criterion Collection, who just released a beautiful brand new Blu-ray of Walker. It's perfecto. It has awesome special features. The film looks and sounds absolutely incredible. So we got really lucky that the Criterion Collection was releasing this beautiful remaster of Walker, and Alex Cox was in the mood to chat about it. Of course, the first half is spoiler-free, and then we have a clear announcement and get into the spoilers. And if you have not seen Walker, I highly recommend you check it out. Aside from it being a fantastic Ed Harris performance, it's a cool film that really is of its time, as you'll hear us talk about. And I don't want to say any more about it because the craziness of the film goes a little beyond just Ed Harris's performance, but also lies in some of the genius behind the filmmaking. I'm a longtime fan of Alex Cox's, so it was a blast to interview him, and he was very forthcoming about his creative process. So I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine. Folks, we are 10 years old this June, and we are preparing as cool of an issue as we can. And there's a lot of good stuff now in our Oscar issue, and we've even continued adding stories to it after we published that are not Oscar stories because we could do that. We're a digital magazine. So if you've never read us before, I hope you'll check out the iPad app Backstory, or just read us on a desktop or laptop at backstory.net. And you could test drive us by reading our free issue, which shows you what we're all about. And if you want to become a subscriber, and I really hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners at iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where all these interviews go because they started as Zooms. You can see them over there. It would really mean a lot to me to have your support as subscribers to Backstory Magazine. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our conversation with director Alex Cox about his wild and crazy 1987 film Walker, which has been remastered for the Criterion Collection. I'm a very long time fan, and I would be remiss if I didn't start going kind of back early in your career and talking about Repo Man. But before I do that, I just want to hear from you. What led you down this path? What was it about writing and directing that appealed to you from a young age and sent you towards the film school vibe?
Well, I always used to like to go to the movies. I went to the cinema a lot when I was a youth. And when I was an undergraduate, I was a law student, but there was a lot of amateur dramatics. And so I found myself increasingly engaged in directing and acting in student stage productions. And having done that and not developed any interest or affinity in the law, I thought I would stick at it. And in those days, you could go to school for almost nothing. You could have a summer job and it would pay for your entire year of college. And so I went to Bristol Film School in England for a year, and then I got a Fulbright to go to UCLA.
Well, so I absolutely love Repo Man, and I could do an entire episode about it. Criterion has an amazing Blu-ray for it with a lot of great extras. One of my favorite moments I've just always been curious about, so I've got to ask, is when Otto finds out that the job he's being offered is to work as a Repo Man. He just dumps out his beer. He just literally dumps out his beer on the floor. And it was just hilarious. And I'm just curious if you remember about the creation of that strange moment, be it on the page or live on set, because it's a great nonverbal reaction that says a lot without saying anything.
I think it was in the script. I think it was scripted. I don't recall that being an improvisation. When Cy comes in afterwards and says, "Somebody piss on the floor again," that was an improvisation.
That's an amazing line. I love the end of the movie with everything connecting the aliens to what the government has been tracking. And you just did this great moment with the televangelist showing up. And I always like hearing about things that maybe were on the page, but you didn't have time to shoot. And we're going to talk about that as well with Walker. But Was there ever more of a connection between the televangelist and the hunt for the alien? Because it was such a funny thing to be thrown in that I've just always found it amazing.
The guy who was supposed to come out of the helicopter was Muhammad Ali, because I had met that afternoon at Gold's Gym, which was in a very small gym on Main Street in Venice. I'd met Muhammad Ali because I saw him through the window.
Wow.
He was just in Gold's Gym. And so I went in. He was sitting with all these guys. And I said I was a film director. I was making my movie. And I wondered if I could ask him to do a cameo downtown LA that night. And he spoke very softly. And he goes, "What's the role?" And I said, "Well, it's you're like the most powerful, important man in the world. And you get out of the helicopter," which he was. Yes. Not the most powerful, the most important. And you get out of the helicopter and you approach this glowing car and you almost reach it, but then even you are forced back by the ethereal power of the glowing car. And the hero gets in and they fly away. And he goes, "Oh, it sounds very interesting. But I've got a manager now." And the manager says, I can't do anything for less than $1 million. If you can come up with $1 million between now and this evening, I'll be there. And I goes, yes. So I called the executive producer, Michael Nesmith, and I say, "Muhammad Ali will be in our film for only $1 million. Can you get Universal on the phone and see if they'll go for it?" And Nesmith says, "They won't."
What was the entire budget of Repo Man?
That was the budget, I think, was about $1 million. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, so $1 million for 30 seconds, probably. That was an ask. That was definitely an ask. Well, before we move on, what was your toughest scene? What was the toughest scene for you to concoct on the page for Repo Man? The one that you kept coming back to over and over, trying to crack?
Oh, they weren't very hard to write. No, the scenes weren't very hard to write. I mean, There were scenes I wrote that weren't very good, that we ended up not using. And the editor, Dennis Dolan, was a very interventionist editor who had actually worked on Peckinpah movies. He'd worked on Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid and on Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. And so he was very used to the idea that, well, the story's not complete yet. You need to go out and shoot this scene, or you need to go out and shoot these shots to add to that scene, And we did, So it was the most fluid editorial process. It was really, a lot of things were down to the intervention of Dennis.
Sure. That's great. Well, Sid Nancy is another classic. It's also another fantastic Criterion disc. And again, I would be happy to do a podcast all about Sid Nancy. But, I think the way to just boil it down, because, it has an avant-garde feel to it in which we're going a little beyond reality, especially, when Sid's shooting at the audience with his gun. Like, there's just so many great moments in that movie. What was your most difficult artistic challenge as a writer on that film, just to kind of boil it down?
Oh, I don't think it was hard to write either. I mean, Abby Wall was my co-author. She was very, very aware and kept saying that every scene in the film has to do with the subject of the film. And I would go, "What is the subject of the film?" She goes, "What is the title of the film?" The title of the film back then was Love Kills. Right. So that was just Abby keeping it on track and saying that every scene has to say "Love Kills."
I think you accomplished that goal without a doubt. I love Sid Nancy. It's rare that as an interviewer that I inject myself into an interview, but this one's kind of a special case in which I've always been a fan of your work, and I am adapting 2 different properties by the author Harry Harrison. And
no way.
Yes, and for years, we've had dinners and drinks, right up until he got too sick to come to the States and passed away, sadly, in 2012. And as we talked about films and filmmakers, your name had come up. And he told me about this extraordinary time where you and him went around trying to pitch a movie version of his book, Bill the Galactic Hero. And he said it was fun. He really liked you. It was a bummer that it didn't happen and the powers that be wouldn't fund it. And then when I was just glancing over your IMDb page, that was the last I'd ever heard of it. I noticed that there was a version of Bill the Galactic Hero that your name is associated with as a director, with a series of students in Boulder, Colorado, made in 2014, 2 years after Harry passed away. And I have no idea what this project is. So I'm just curious about any thoughts you want to give us about the time when you were pitching Bill with Harry and what this project was that you made with these students?
Just go to my website. There's a load of stuff about it on the website, and you can watch the film on Vimeo.
Right.
It was a student project. I proposed to Harry that since I was teaching at Boulder, he should give me like an academic license to make Build the Galactic Hero for nothing. And so he said, fine, talk to my agent. So I talked to Nat Sobel.
Yep.
And Nat said, well, if Harry says it's okay, then it's okay. You know? And so I just made this film with the students. And it took about a year. I was one of 6 directors. There's some good stuff in it. You know, there's some, I mean, I think it's a bit wonky early on because early on we started out shooting in 35 millimeter black and white. And I think that we had bitten off more than we could chew. And so about a third of the way in, we switched to, sad to say, we switched to video and shot the rest of the film on video. But, you know, it has some merit. It has some merit. When Harry died before we'd finished it, unfortunately, but his daughter and his son and their kind of extended family came out for the premiere in Bold. Now, awesome. Which are the Harry Harrison projects that you've adapted?
You know, I put together some of his short stories that are going to make a film, and also a book that was just a childhood favorite of mine that I'm working furiously on called A Rebel in Time. And it's just one of his greatest books in my opinion, you know, next to obviously the Stainless Steel Rat, which he's most famous for. Of course, Soylent Green is the only other movie of his that's been made, really. But yeah, Rebel in Time is the big one. And then a different movie that it's not an anthology, but it is a from his collection of short stories that piece together a few of his stories. But yes, he always spoke highly of you. And I was really elated when I realized that there was a production of Build the Galactic Hero. That was wild.
It's worth it. I mean, it gets better and better as it goes along.
Well, I want to talk about your creative habit for a second. When you sit down to write, how important is outlining to your process?
It depends. If it's an existing story about somebody or about events, then the structure is more important, I think, to have a proper structure. But if it's just freewheeling, then I don't think there necessarily has to be an outline. You just start writing and see what happens.
Well, so when you sit down to write each day, do you give yourself an amount of time that you want to write with, or do you give yourself a certain page count to hit?
No, neither one really. I'm not very disciplined. I mean, writing is fun, you know, so just I try and get through the other stuff, try and get through the emails and the eating and things, and then I can take the dog for a walk, and then you know, you can sit down and write, you know, and that can go on for a while, go on all afternoon.
So you just do it as a form of enjoyment, I think, which is a great way to say that it shouldn't feel like a task.
It has to be enjoyable. If it's not enjoyable, then I don't think. I mean, look at Harry Harrison and how productive he was. He must have enjoyed writing.
Absolutely. He really was. I want to get into Walker now. And I know that, you know, there's a lot of great extras on the disc. And through one of them, I saw that you were thinking about Walker even before Sid and Nancy. And it was in some of your notebooks, the idea for Walker.
I had talked to Rudy Wurlitzer about writing the script pretty much as soon as I met him. And I think I met him in 1984. And because he had written Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, the two stories seemed to me to be so similar about individuals seeking their own death, but only doing so by crawling up a mound of bodies which they've created. And that seemed to be his take on Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And that was my take on Walker. So I thought this is the guy to write the script.
I mean, it's an incredible story. For anyone that doesn't know, William Walker is an American who invaded Nicaragua and basically declared himself president and was trying to do this all as a part of Manifest Destiny. And it really is a fascinating script. Was there ever a time that you were going to co-write it with Rudy, or were you just kind of collaborating with him as a director?
No, I was just collaborating with this director. He's a proper writer. He doesn't need a collaborator.
Of course.
You collaborate in terms of talking about what's in the script and what might change. But no, he was like totally autonomous.
Okay. And so when did he start writing it? When did you first see a draft?
During Sid and Nancy. Well, he came to London when we were shooting Sid and Nancy, and we talked about it. And he was going to write the script in my apartment in Bermondsey in London, which is pretty grim. And so he stayed there for a couple of days, and he said, I think I'd like to go home and write it there. You know? So he went back to New York, carried on writing. Then when we came out to shoot Sid and Nancy in New York, we got together again and talked about the script during that process.
You were coming up as a director at this time. This is basically your third major feature film, or fourth.
After Space Test.
Yes, sorry, fourth. And in each of your films, you really have a knack for being playful and grounded with your actors. And it's something that's hard to teach about when to give an actor all their space, but also when to reel them in a little as a director. Walker is an absolutely phenomenal Ed Harris performance. Just phenomenal. Tell us what you learned as a young filmmaker directing this force of nature. And, this is after you've directed Gary Oldman and Sid Nancy. You directed a veteran like Harry Dean Stanton and Repo Man, along with another great cast. You were really on a track, and still are, of course, as a great director of actors. And I'm just curious, what are some of the things that you were picking up at that point in your career?
Harry Dean Stanton said to me that I was a second-rate director compared to Francis Coppola. And I said, "What's the difference, Harry Dean?" And he goes, "Because Francis Coppola lets me do whatever the fuck I want." So I thought, well, I will always be a second-rate director, I guess. But I was really, he was right, Harry, in a certain way, because you want to let actors go. You want to cast the film well. And if you cast the film well, then you can confidently let the actors go, because they'll know the character that they're playing better than you do. Because the director has to think of all kinds of things, lunch, when is lunch, and where are we going to be tomorrow, what else happening, and a number of other technical matters. And whereas actors only have to think about their character.
It's really an amazing performance. How much time for rehearsal did you have before the film started shooting in Nicaragua?
We didn't really rehearse. I mean, we had a production breakdown in Nicaragua because the actors were all there, but the equipment, which was coming by land from Mexico, got held up for a week in Guatemala. And during that week, we hung out and probably had a script reading. But the main thing that we did was take the actors on a forced march through the Nicaraguan countryside to acquaint them with the place. Linda Callahan wrote a piece about that, which I think is included in the elements of the Criterion disc, about going for a walk through the Nicaraguan countryside with Ed Harris and Eddie Tudor-Pole and Joe Strummer and Rene Beaugenbois, Dick Rude, all these actors.
It's a cool piece. I read it. It's definitely one of the many great features that's part of the Criterion edition. And, I would be remiss if I didn't say this. Walker is a great film, but it's also one of those, and you could watch it at any time. It's going to be great whenever you put it in. If you've never seen it, if it's your first time and you're watching it now, it's great. But it's also one of those rare films that was in and of its time, like cemented in time, coming out at the exact perfect time in the 1980s when the Sandinista-Contra war was ongoing and was an important, fresh look again at American imperialism down there. Talk about what it was like to film something so current where you could easily argue the end of the story is not yet written, but it is because you're doing a historical drama and you have a specific perspective that you want to add to this story that makes it relevant to the day that you were shooting it.
It was interesting because the war got worse as we went along. So when we were doing prep in Nicaragua the previous year, the effects of the Contra War against the Nicaraguans weren't as apparent. But when we were shooting the film, we did encounter a number of people who said they'd lost a family member or, in the Contra War. They had friends in the country who were murdered. Money was really tight. Inflation was really bad. So while we were making the film, in very privileged circumstances, you could see that things were getting more and more difficult for Nicaraguans in their daily lives. And it was only a couple of years after we made Walker that, was it George H.W. Bush invaded Panama, but essentially invaded Panama from within because of the massive military base that was based there, and wrecked the country, kidnapped the president, etc. And that was also a clear message to the Nicaraguans. So on the one hand, the enthusiasm of the Nicaraguan people and their niceness and the beauty of the country were like really great and encouraging. But the degree of fear and concern that existed as to whether the US really would invade Nicaragua at that time got more and more intense the longer we were there. So it was a very interesting time.
How dangerous as a filmmaker was it to be filming with an active fight going on?
We weren't filming. I mean, sometimes we were in places where, like when we were on the southern border, there were Contras south of the border.
Right.
And occasionally we heard gunfire. But we were never in a situation where there was fighting. We never.
Okay.
You couldn't, I mean, you just couldn't
Right.
do it. You couldn't put the actors to a situation like that, or the crew, or anybody, because it would be far too dangerous.
Well, I mean, one of the great things about this Criterion release is that there is 50 minutes of a documentary of behind the scenes that were shot that really,
it's interesting.
It's a great archival document, to kind of see behind the scenes as the film was being made. So that's fantastic. And, podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify, YouTube watchers on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, we are giving our spoiler alert warning now. If you have never seen Walker, we are going to get into some of the spoilers. It has a beautiful Blu-ray edition, and it's just been released by Criterion. It's absolutely gorgeous. There it is. It's being held up for you to see on our YouTube page. And we're going to get into the spoilers now. One of the things that really made me sit up in my seat the first time that I was watching it was when you, being you, a wild and crazy guy that we love, decided to go anachronistic and to have things out of time, to start linking it more to the modern day of 1986 when you were filming it. It came out in 87. And some people could argue that just making this film about an American invading Nicaragua is enough, right? It's historical record. That would be the coded message of our imperialism hasn't waned. But as Walker himself is reacting to news reports, suddenly he's holding a in color Newsweek magazine. And there's also People magazine. And those magazines did not exist at the time. And they certainly, even if they did, but they did not, would not be on glossy paper with beautiful color photos. And
no, they didn't have Mercedes-Benz limousines.
Right, of course. And he's being driven around in a limousine. And I'm like, oh, wow, what is going on here? Because time is being fractured. And, again, like it then gets back to its period, but then he's giving a press conference to some journalists. Every one of them is holding a cassette recorder in their hands. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting, because he's linking it to today. Flash forward to the end of the movie, where literally a helicopter is landing. The American State Department representative is there. People are showing modern passports to get on to the helicopter. It is just the wildest ending. And again, absolutely a beautiful way to link it toward the events of the day and remind the audience not to be passive, but that history was again repeating itself. Tell me about
a process. History is a process. It doesn't stop.
So tell me about how that idea came about in what could have otherwise still worked 100% as an amazing historical drama.
I think that one of the reasons that Rudy and I wanted to work together was because we were born with that type of historical drama, where everything is seen through the eyes of a decent Western journalist. So no matter how villainous the activities that are portrayed, they're always mediated through this white Western voice of reason, whether it's The Year of Living Dangerously or Salvador or whatever the film might be. And Rudy and I felt that the journalists, then as now, were entirely complicit in creating an environment where war was popular and encouraging warmongering. And so we didn't see any good characters, with the exception of Marley Matlins, who dies early on. And so for us, the anachronisms are part of that. We're just going to make the film that we want to make, and we're going to tell the story that we want to tell, because we don't have to be constrained by this really dull narrative of, we're going to tell a historical story through the eyes of a sympathetic journalist. So we didn't. And I think that at that time also there was more of an opening for adventurous forms of narrative than there is now. And so Derek Jarman had made Caravaggio, which had a number of anachronisms in it.
Interesting.
And also there was a Russian film called Remembrance about Stalin, made around about the same time of the year before, which also kind of broke into the contemporary present and then back to the 1930s and 40s. And so I think that there was a push in the cinema at that time to be more adventurous. and more rule break.
I love it because it's so seamless. You know, if you're for some reason not entirely paying attention, you could miss the tape recorders in the hand. I mean, you're not going to miss the Mercedes driving an 1850 and the glossy magazine covers. But what's so amazing is that even as absolutely crazy and cool as that ending is, on the Criterion disc, you mention a crazier ending that you guys scuttled, in which Walker comes to a 600 plate dinner in Washington, D.C. to be honored amongst televangelists, celebrities like Charlton Heston and other right wingers at the time that would have supported this. At what point did you decide to go away from that ending, which, by the way, I would note would be much cheaper than what you filmed with helicopters and a shootout? And I would love to hear more about that ending and what made you change.
Yeah, I don't remember why that ending went, because it was a good ending, but it still would have taken a little bit of something to make it happen. You know, we would have had to rent a big hotel suite in DC, fill it with extras, and try and persuade Charlton Heston to be in it, you know, and so it would have been complicated. And I think probably by that point we'd exhausted the budget. I think we would have liked to film it,
right?
Because it would have been a great possibility, you know, to end the film that way after the helicopters came.
It's just a perfect ending. I mean, even down to the moment where the State Department official asks Walker, is he an American citizen? What's his job? And he says, I'm the president of Nicaragua. And he pushes him away, assuming that he has no American lineage, so he can't come on the helicopter. It was beautiful, sir. You know, making a movie like this with all the fire and explosions and, you know, squibs and gunfire, it's important for safety. And I'm just curious what you as a director learned, because it's a major step up from any of your previous works in which you were dealing with a lot of effects because of making a war movie, essentially. So what were some of the interesting things you learned about safety as a director?
The effects were always fine because they were under the control of a guy called Marcelino Pacheco, who was like the #1 Mexican special effects, visual effects guy. And everything that Pacheco did went extremely well. Nothing went wrong. I wouldn't play with helicopters anymore. I think having used helicopters in Repo Man and Sid Nancy and Walker, that's enough helicopters, because they're fundamentally, you know, potentially extremely dangerous.
Sure.
And if anything goes wrong, they just fall. So I think I would avoid, knowing what I now know, I would avoid helicopters. But other than that, you know, and of course, you don't really need to do all that squibbery now. You don't really need to like dress people up with wires and put condoms full of Kensington gore under their shirt, because we do it all digitally. It all gets done digitally.
Yeah, as long as you have the budget for it. Speaking of budget, what was the budget and schedule for Walker?
I think the budget of Walker, all told, was according to Universal, was $5.6 million. Now, 20% of that will be studio overhead. So that probably brings the budget down to a bit less than 5.
Sure.
Or around 5. And the shooting period was 9 weeks.
Okay. Wow. That's a very robust shoot.
And we edited in Nicaragua for 2 months after that. Joe Strummer stayed down in Nicaragua with us to compose the score. And then we went up to San Francisco to finish post-production.
The score is amazing. I mean, your collaborations with Joe Strummer are just excellent, but this is especially a standout.
Oh, yeah. No, it's a fantastic soundtrack. I mean, I think, funnily enough, because Joe and I, when we were in Granada, sitting there in the evening, and it would rain in the evenings, and we'd look at movies. We had a limited number of video cassettes, and the ones that we watched the most were Ran, the Kurosawa film,
sure,
and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And I think we watched Pat Garrett so much because Joe was interested in what Bob Dylan had done on the score there. And this was the first time that I did a movie which had a score by only one composer. Previously, they'd all been kind of rock and roll mishmash. But on this one, Joe said, Al, I think this time it would be good if you had a movie which only had one composer, for the whole thing. And who could he have meant?
It was an amazing collaboration. What was something left on the floor? It's always interesting to hear in editing. What were some of the things that were either left on the floor or things that you scuttled before you even shot, like left turns that you either couldn't afford to shoot or you just decided that you didn't need? It's just always interesting to hear of those those scenes that slip away?
I guess we dropped the death scene of Joe and Dick Rude, where they've fled and then been caught and brought back to Walker and asked forgiveness, and he won't forgive them, has them both shot. But we lost that just because the film seemed to be going long. It seemed to be getting long, get more compressed. And there were scenes that didn't involve Walker. And what we realized as we were shooting was that it was all about Walker. And that so some of the actors were quite disappointed because they came to Nicaragua with long scenes, which they acted and we shot, but then those scenes got condensed or dropped because it was all about Walker. It had to be all about Walker.
Yeah. And again, just an incredible performance. What was one of your toughest scenes as a director? It could be something that was either logistically complicated or something just creatively complicated that you remember. You have those two hats that you talked about earlier. You need to be the ally for the actors, but you need to make your day and keep your crew moving. So what was something that you remember being really difficult as a director when you were on set?
The Bond company, Film Finances, the guy coming from Film Finances, this little putz, and saying that the Bond company, you had to have a Bond in those days. And they would take like 5% of the budget and just keep it, with the idea that if the director was like died or was totally screwed up and couldn't finish the film, the Bond company would send him and finish it.
Right, as part of the insurance.
They never did, and they just pocketed the 5%. But when we were shooting on Walker, we were shooting a battle scene with horses and explosions and stuff. We had 3 cameras. So I said to Dave Bridges, or to the second cameraman, Steve Fearberg, I said, get the other camera out of the box and put it over there. And this little putz from the Bond company with his polo shirt and his white trousers says, no, I'm not allowing you to do that. And I go, what do you mean? You're not allowing me to do that? And he goes, enhancement. And I go, what? Enhancement, he says. So I say, fuck you. We get the camera out of the box and shoot with 3 cameras because it's a battle scene, we've got film stock cameras, let's use them. But that really, really upset the guys at the Bond company. And we were put on probation. They said they were going to cancel the bond. Pressman then said he would sue them since we hadn't actually done anything wrong.
Right.
But I think in the way the Bond company were acting as a stooge for Universal, and if the film had collapsed or had been shut down by the Bond company, that could have been used as a way to demonstrate why Nicaragua was an unreliable place where films should not be made.
Interesting.
And from our perspective, it was very important that the film not be shut down and that it get made in order to generate, a different perspective from Nicaragua.
I mean, it's amazing you got through it. You mentioned something in one of you did a short film in a cabin, and you mentioned that you wanted to, at one point, to fool the Bond company, possibly use a different title for the film, which I thought was a strange and interesting tactic that you said that you never were able to accomplish, but it was in your early prep as one of your ideas. You were somehow going to use
what that was, but I have to look at the elements of the film to find out what that was.
Yeah, it was in your Criterion supplementary. But it was interesting because
I'll study those elements.
Yeah, it was a beautiful element, but it was interesting. This came out, a few critics got it, and because you were doing something that could be deemed experimental, some of the tone of a very serious version of Walker and then almost a hyper realistic, surreal version of Walker, it confused critics. And you talked about that on the disc.
I think that people get an expectation. I mean, that's one reason why if you wouldn't normally invite a lot of critics to the set or a lot of movie journalists, but because of the political importance of getting people to come to Nicaragua, getting Americans and Western Europeans to come to Nicaragua so that they could experience the reality of it for themselves and not through the lying media of the New York Times. It was important to let the journalists in on that occasion. But in general, you shouldn't do that because then they get an expectation of what the film will be like based on the time that they've spent there and what little they've seen, which quite likely won't mesh with what the finished film is like.
Right. I mean, literally the Iran-Contra deals were going on at that time near when the film came out, a little after the film came out. And, it was amazing to see kind of some of the lies that were being told that were supporting imperialist view.
And that is now, because who's the point man for Venezuela for us to try and destabilize the Venezuelan government and steal all their funds in the Bank of England? Step forward, Elliot Abrahams, who was doing the same devil's work back in the 1980s.
You did an amazing job of capturing just the wild spirit of Walker. This is a great film at any time about American imperialism. I guess my last question to you would be, having been so immersed in it, you could only tell so much in 96 minutes. Do you think there's still more room, more margins for people to experience another story about Walker and American imperialism and how it was handled?
A number of American journalists and film people were really upset by Walker, really offended by it. And I remember that Robert Redford announced that the film was crap. Wow. And that he, Robert Redford, was going to direct and star in his own film about William Walker. I thought, great, well, let that happen. Let's do it. Let's have a whole series of films about William Walker. And what about a film about Smedley Butler, who served in Nicaragua as a henchman for United Fruit and wrote a book called War is a Racket? That would be a great movie.
Wow. Well, look, I'm a longtime fan of your work, and I'm so glad that Criterion put out this amazing release of Walker so people could see it in the best version possible. I'd love to have you back anytime. Alex Cox, thanks again so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to director Alex Cox for being so generous with his time and coming down to chat about his remastered film, Walker. And folks, really, if you have not seen this film, please go check out the beautiful Criterion Collection Blu-ray of Walker. It's a great film. It has a bunch of fantastic special features, so I know you will totally dig it. And speaking of things to dig while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine. And folks, we are turning 10 in June, and I couldn't be more excited about it. It's been 10 years. I can't even believe it. And if you've never read us before, you could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And of course, you could test drive us by reading our free issue, but we have a lot of cool stuff planned for our new issue to celebrate our 10th year. And even our Oscar issue, we keep updating because we're a digital magazine and we could do that. So look, if you're interested in becoming a subscriber, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. And that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. So thanks for considering. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2022. All rights reserved. Folks, if you want to reach out to me, and I'm always happy to hear from you, you could find me on Twitter as Yo Goldsmith or as Backstory_mag, or you could find me under those same handles on Instagram as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag. I also have a Facebook fan page somewhere, and you could even send an email if you want to write me an email to backstoryletters@gmail.com. And I go through that email as often as I can, so just don't be dismayed if I don't answer immediately. It just means I'm working on a podcast or the next issue, but I love hearing from everybody. So feel free to drop me a line anytime. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.